This is Bonnie Brescia from BBK Worldwide with another edition of our Pharma15 series. I'm thrilled to welcome three other individuals who participated with me in a panel at the recent Patient as Partners European conference. And let me introduce them to you now. Necka Smith is a sickle cell disease patient advocate. She's also an allied health worker and an educator. She is currently participating in a clinical trial. Thomas Smith is a cystic fibrosis patient and advocate. He's a life sciences public engagement advisor, having worked with industry, research ethics committees, multiple European patient organizations. Phil Kelly is a bladder cancer patient and advocate through the Action Bladder Cancer UK. He's a patient advisor who's been involved in research and in supporting other patients with bladder cancer. And his participation in trials is really more as a member of a management committee helping to design trials. We're going to focus today on a number of questions that we received from the attendees at this other conference. There were many that we didn't have a chance to get to a couple of weeks back. And so I'd like to ask each of you to answer for us the first question of, what do you believe is the single most powerful way to establish trust between a study participant or potential study participant and the study team? Necka, can I ask you to kick that off for us?
Yep. So from personal experiences on both sides, as being a clinician, but also as being a patient, I think the most important thing is that our communications are authentic. So I, as a healthcare worker, have to work to what we call the duty of candor. So I have to be open and honest and, you know, accept if I made any mistakes or anything. And I think being open like that allows patients to see that we are humans and form human interactions, and it allows us to get closer. I think when you see that raw engagement and enthusiasm in a clinician who's about to undertake a trial with you, and they're open with you about what they hope to find out, but also what might happen, any potential side effects and how they're going to record those, any feelings you might have, whether that be physical, mental, emotional, and just be really, really open about the fact that clinical trials affect you more broadly than just on whatever health condition that the trial is focusing on. It really can have an impact on your mental health and your well-being, and to know that they are there for you, and these are the strategies that they're going to put in place to look after you. And, you know, I am the person who's going to be there, whether it be at the end of the phone, on email, or however you wish to interact, or we have planned for you to interact with us. I am there for you to get in touch with. I think that within anything is how we all engage.
When we were speaking a couple of weeks back, we were talking in the context of decentralized or hybrid, or even virtual was being used as a term sometimes. Thomas, when you're thinking about establishing trust between the clinical team and the study participant, do you think that is different in the decentralized environment, or more broadly, what do you believe is the most powerful way to establish trust?
I think that there has to be the same approach to hybrid trials as any other, because it doesn't matter where your participant is, you need to connect with them. I think what Necka said about authentic communication with the lead clinician is extremely important. But I think at a broader level, I think it's about transparency. I really do. I think it's both parties agreeing, this is what's going to happen. We're not hiding anything. I don't think participants are suspicious, but obviously they have concerns about, what this if new treatment could mean for them or something like that. And also, I think historically, pharma has suffered with a bit of a bad reputation, which is not my experience of it at all. The whole thing is way more human than I ever would have given credit for. But I think it's just about being transparent and open and honest and genuine.
Phil, you spoke very clearly about the fact that you really would prefer, and believe most patients would prefer, to do that in person.
I think it's important at the beginning of a trial, when somebody's new to it, that there's a direct face-to-face meeting with the real people that are going to be involved with the patient throughout the trial, and the opportunity to speak directly and to hear directly from lead clinicians, I think, is going to be critical to establishing the relationship with the trial as a whole. Maybe down the line, once the person's been recruited and committed to the aspirations of the trial, then the use of technology, especially if it's going to be beneficial to the patient in maybe reducing the demands on them in terms of travel, time, having to access hospitals, then fine, that can be helpful. And Zoom calls with the clinicians whilst you're at home, if you're a poorly patient, may actually be extremely beneficial. But I think at the beginning, it's critical to be face-to-face, eyeball to eyeball with the people that are going to be running the trial and leading the trial.
Thank you. One of the things that I've heard from a patient was, wouldn't it be nice to have the clinical team call me on the day of the appointment or the day before and ask, how is your day going? Is this still a good day for your visit? This is particularly true of people who have serious medical conditions or are really ill. Is it still a good day for your visit? Would you rather do this remotely, or should we reschedule? What can we do to be more sensitive to where a particular patient may be on a given day? Nneka, you mentioned just a minute ago about being in a trial impacts so many aspects of your health and well-being. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, so I'm quite fortunate because I'm actively on a trial at present, which means I have first-hand kind of experience of this whole change in process. So I was still having to attend the hospital for my infusions and things, even at the peak of COVID. And so at the time I was shielding. So I would get phone calls and I would get, you're due to have a blood test today. How are you feeling? Are you still able to come to us? What sort of time should we expect you? So I was fortunate because that gave me a lot of flexibility. I'm quite an extroverted person. So for me, leaving the house was never a problem. And suddenly I was like, oh, I've got to leave the house, and having a bit of anxiety around that. So those phone calls were really reassuring for me and really helpful for me, because it gave me an opportunity to say, actually, look, I'm a bit apprehensive. So it's a good gateway.
Yeah. Is that something that you would like to have continue after COVID isn't part of the equation?
So my trials changed slightly. So because I've been on it for a year, I now don't have to go for pre-bloods and things like that. So that communication level is reducing slightly. But I still do get check-ins, I get emails, I get the occasional phone calls, and it does make a difference. It really does. And it makes it more likely for me to be able to contact them and say, look, I'm not feeling great. I'm not sure if I can make it next week. Can we look at rescheduling or something like that? Whereas I think before I was more hesitant to call and say, I'm not feeling great. I don't think I would leave it till the last possible minute, which is the worst thing you could do on a trial. You know, the earlier the better, and the easier it is to reschedule things. So I think that active communication and them reaching out first makes a big difference further down the line. It makes the patient more comfortable. It makes them feel like they're able to call and then start taking the lead because they've had that in return at the beginning.
Thomas, one of the questions that we were asked was, do you believe, and you probably have had this question in some of the work that you've done with the ethics committees, are tools such as wearables or mobile apps something that are attractive to study participants? And is that worth balancing the risks of other things that may come from using and incorporating these kinds of things into a study design?
I always love a gadget. You know, if I can get something something new and fun to play with out of it, then it definitely helps. And it's only if it fits properly in line with what I mentioned. What part of a transactional relationship, i.e. participating in a trial, am I interested in? Is this gadget suitable for that? Can I keep it afterwards? Do I have to give it back and things like that? So I think there's definitely a bit of it's not a gimmick, I suppose, but it can feel like I've had an iPad once, which I had to give back at the end of 12 months, and it made it more fun, I suppose, because at the time I didn't have an iPad and I'd never used one. So it definitely, you know, as much as I'm ashamed to admit it, it definitely helps keep me interested in it. And you know, it's always fun, you know, especially if it's something new. So yeah, I think they're great.
You're a fan. Phil, why do I think your answer is going to be different to that question?
It's not going to be different. It's maybe going to be a bit qualified. I'd have a concern that the wearable or the device was going to actually be of benefit to the patient. So if it's something that's going to help them to know how they're doing physically or health-wise, that would be fine. If it was just something that fed back into the trial and there wasn't the feedback loop where the patient was getting feedback to say, you know, we've been looking at the readings, this is what it's telling us, you know, let's have a conversation about it. Because otherwise it's going to become a bit mechanical. It needs to help both people, the trial and also the patient. Otherwise, I'm not sure that you can justify it. I mean, in terms of Tom having to give back the iPad, I'm not sure that's justifiable after a year. I would have thought, you know, there's no reason why patients can't benefit at the end of a trial if they've contributed towards it. Those kinds of costs can be built into the initial funding.
Here's a very concrete question, and I'm not sure that this resource or tool is used very often in clinical research, but I know that it is in other parts of the online experience for individuals. What would you think about incorporating chatbots into a study where a prospective or actual study participant might have access through something more like that?
I think there is, but only in a very limited way. I think if I had questions about the protocol, what am I supposed to be doing? When am I supposed to be doing it? Then I would be satisfied with a chatbot. But if I had actual concerns, it would be, you know, going back to what Neka said at the beginning, it's about accountability, I think. I want to know that the person that I'm asking a question to has a vested interest in giving me an accurate answer, and you're not going to get that out of a chatbot.
If you had a physical document that showed you what was expected at each visit, or you had a mobile application that would provide you access to that, would you prefer one over the other? Would you want both? Phil, what do you think?
I guess, given my experience of my cancer, bladder cancer is one that tends to affect older people more than younger people. And given the state of development, a lot of the older people with bladder cancer struggle with online and digital devices and communication. So I guess you have to consider the profile of the population that you're working with. Younger people are probably using smartphones, internet, chat lines, all sorts of things day to day, but others might not be. And there might even be a little bit of a gender profile aspect. Certainly some of the online communities I've seen for cancer are used more by women than by men, certainly men of a certain age. So I think you just have to customize it according to the patient population that you're working with, perhaps.
That I think also goes to an issue that we're seeing over time. You may have a multi-year study, and individuals' use of connected technologies may be changing in the course of a 2 or 3 year period. So for me, that speaks to revisiting and asking questions of study participants as time goes by. How have those needs changed? How have your openness to or preference for some digital connectivity? But it is a challenge when you're in the planning stages and trying to look at how can I decentralize or hybridize certain aspects of the study, knowing that the world evolves and changes. COVID is a perfect example of things we hadn't anticipated when you may have started a study 18 months ago. Can we shift a little bit now? There were many questions about recruiting study participants into decentralized or hybrid trials. One individual was wanting to know how a sponsor might predict patients who would be open to being involved in a decentralized trial. Is that a question you think could be answered? Phil, you're smiling, but Neko, let's draw you in first.
I think the biggest draw to a decentralized or hybridized trial is the fact that a patient is more likely to be seen regularly by their own physicians rather than having to travel to a distant location to a team that they don't know. Mm-hmm. I think those kind of things have a big draw for patients because they're your team, you know them really well, and it kind of enhances then your experience and your treatment. Does that guarantee recruitment? I don't think you can predict that as much, but I think it does go away in reassuring people that being part of the trial means they'll still be looked after and they'll have the access to what they need, whether that be reassurance, information, and things like that. I think that could be a big draw for some.
It's kind of interesting that each of you spoke about how critical it was to establish trust with the lead clinician. And now, Neka, you bring in an interesting point of, well, am I able to incorporate my primary physician, my regular physician, in my participation in a clinical trial. It sounds like that's how you interpret a decentralized trial. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, I think from my experience with a trial based on a pre-existing disorder, rather than something like in Phil's case of bladder cancer. So that's all I can talk on. But from that perspective, if you do have a pre-existing condition and you've been under the care of a primary care physician or team for a very long time, that is a big incentive to then be part of the trial if you can keep that close connection with that primary care team, as well as, you know, building an interaction with a new physician who is leading the trial or running the whole process.
Let me take off on that point. Thomas, what in your view is a decentralized or hybridized trial? What comprises such a trial?
Just not having to, head to a bricks and mortar kind of building, or either kind of not doing it at all or having the choice to do both of those things. And I think going back to what Phil was saying about, what kind of format would I like literature to be, would it, paper, app, whatever. You don't need to make a decision for people, just give them a choice. And I think that's really what it's about for me. And then also to as far as predicting, how many sort of participants you'd be able to get in a trial, I think it's also about speaking to reference networks, patient umbrella organizations, disease-specific patient organizations, and also independent patients as well. And just trying to get, a collection of views on the matter, and really using social media and, people's networks to try and figure out and get a better grasp on things.
And what if we didn't have connectivity with either a patient population, as Phil was alluding to, or within a certain country? How would you imagine, Phil, talking about a decentralized trial without use of the internet at all?
I think I'd be reinforcing what Necker's said about decentralized might not just be about the use of technology. Depending on the actual geography in the country that you're thinking about. I mean, I'm in the UK, but I'm in a very rural part of the UK, and the trial centres for me are in the cities that are probably 2 hours away, travelling time each way. And that could apply even more so in other countries around the world. So I think the opportunity to deliver some of the trial requirements through local health services could be extremely beneficial. And that might well be a very strong selling point for patients to participate. And that could depend a little bit on the nature of the condition that the trial's focusing on. Some conditions will be recruiting people who are very poorly, where travel is a big problem, and that can be a selling point for remote access to a trial. It could be that the illness of the patient varies depending on where they're at in a chemotherapy cycle. And you might, like Tom says, you might need to be offering the flexibility to be able to do both things. So maybe some of the blood tests or some of the other follow-up can be done locally. And I think it's sort of customizing how it can work according to the individual's requirements and the health condition that you may be focusing on.
One of the other areas that people ask a number of questions about, and I know this is an important one for Thomas and a major driver for him in his work, and it's the use of patient input, or particularly patient panels. And what recommendations might you offer to a sponsor of a clinical study or group of studies in building and then maintaining a patient panel?
When was it? A couple of months ago, I did some work for a company, a health data research company, and they were setting up a patient panel because they were looking at issues, or basically, so they develop apps, and they needed people who had accessibility issues to basically test their apps, just to make sure it's completely inclusive and stuff. And they approached me about it, and I said, yes, happy to help, that's great. I said, what I think we should do is involve other independents as well. So it was me and 3 other people, none of which had accessibility issues. It would have been great to have someone who did, obviously, as well, but we didn't know anyone. But yeah, we just kind of we built it out for them, and they were over the moon with what we finished up with. And I think they really felt that even though none of us had accessibility issues, that we had actually kind of set things up for them and covered a lot of ground that they hadn't really anticipated, as far as planning ahead for it and stuff like that. So that's how I've done it so far, and it's worked really well.
So am I hearing you correctly that even though they weren't including the people who could provide insight or evidence of things they need to work on, by talking with people who didn't have that problem, they learned different things that they should consider in developing the mobile apps?
Yeah, and I think so you don't necessarily need people with a common experience of disease or chronic illness or whatever. It's sometimes, for example, yeah, like I said, none of us had accessibility issues. We all had motor function and stuff like that. But I think that we were able to kind of advise them on things to think about. And I think, with rare disease, chronic illness, whatever, you name it, there is some common ground there. You don't necessarily need to have, those problems yourself. And yeah, like I say, it worked well.
Mm-hmm. Phil, what would you advise study sponsors? What steps to take, or what should they be thinking about in developing an effective patient panel? How do you just not tick the box, but really build a team that you can learn from, connect with, rely on?
I mean, it probably is about timing. I think if you're going to do that, if you're going to have a patient panel, then you probably need to be setting it up right from the start, rather than trying to do it subsequently, so that they can feel that they're actually part of the trial from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of recruitment, it's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, and you want to have the right people participating, which is very challenging. So I guess, as Tom said earlier, maybe a good starting point might be to go to the charities, the patient advocacy groups, the communities that are linked to that particular condition, to see if there are any particular patient individuals who've been in similar situations where they've been able to share their experiences in a very coherent way. Because I think just having a group of patients for the sake of patients is maybe not going to do the job. You need the right people. And in some ways, as Tom says, you might not actually need all of the patients to have that particular condition to be able to think about having that condition. But certainly if you've got some who have, but you need people who are going to be able to contribute to the trial. I've certainly got experience of helping to establish such a panel. It was developed at a very early stage and helped the trial to develop the patient information that was going to be used in the trial. And they were able to sort of rehearse processes with that group.
That goes to, yeah, to what my follow-on question was going to be is, what methods should study teams include in the category of patient input? And you're just about to jump into, I think, Phil, the idea of doing run-throughs on certain aspects of the study plan.
Definitely. I mean, I've advised a lot of trials in the early stages, and I've quite often been able to say to them, the kinds of processes that you're proposing just aren't going to work for people. It's pretty obvious that it's not going to work. You need to start with asking the questions of patients as to the suitability of your plan. Because quite often clinicians can forget about critical factors that are important to patients. I mean, patients have got their own lives, they've got families, they've got work commitments, they've got dogs, children, but turning up at a hospital or for a blood test isn't a simple matter of they're sat there waiting to turn up to do it. You have to think about the practicalities of it from a patient perspective. So the way to find that out is to ask them from the beginning before you start to establish your plan and your processes, would be my suggestion, because you could avoid an awful lot of very obvious and avoidable pitfalls and blockages in terms of both recruitment and participation.
Even if your plan is to execute a decentralized trial or study, you need to incorporate patients in providing feedback as if it even weren't a decentralized study. And those questions then would be layered on top of that. Nneka, how important do you believe it is for members of patient panels to be knowledgeable about clinical research? And in what way are novices going to add, or can they add, value?
It's an interesting point. I think representation in everything we do is very important. So you need somebody on a patient panel who is aware of how patients are going to feel and what they're going to experience. I think you need a combination of the two. I think you need somebody on that panel who's actively either been part of a trial or has actively been part of representing those in the disease categories in previous trials. But I also think you need novice candidates, because what novice candidates can do is just raise questions that those who've been active and part of trials or part of the process of designing trials might just take for granted or not really see as an issue anymore, because they've been through it and they've worked around an issue, and therefore they can think, well, if this comes up, we'll be able to work around it. But for a novice person, for them that's a bigger issue, and do they want to wait for that issue to come up before it's worked around or figured out? Does it mean more to them that is something they know the answer to before they're willing to become a participant, or they're willing to kind of spread the word about this trial and this study that they've been part of a panel from? So it's really, really important that we don't just settle for what we know, and we don't just settle for the information that's been gathered from previous studies or previous patient panels, that we're always willing to be open and to learn and to take a point of view and perspective from different people. And that's why we always have to have a very wide and diverse network that we draw information from.
Thomas, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, please. I think it'd be hypocritical of me to campaign for parity with patient involvement and not acknowledge that the point of view of a novice is equally important as someone like me who's kind of, you know, studied this kind of thing and stuff. I think it's really, sorry about the dog. It's really important to, if you're going to involve novices on a panel, you have to foster an environment where they feel comfortable asking questions. I think because otherwise it can end up, I suppose, a bit like any other bad patient involvement where it's like you're just there. As long as you're sat in the chair in the same room, we're not bothered about what you've got to think about it. Or, you know, or because if you're in a room with, I suppose, perceived experts, it would be very easy to feel pushed out of that. And I think that novices have a tremendous amount of value, purely for the reasons Neca said about, you know, it's all a bit old hat, and you know how all this kind of, you know, research, clinical development goes and stuff like that. It's really easy to lose your perspective and not think like the man in the street, so to speak. And yeah, I think that novice experience is super valuable, but we have to do a really good job of, you know, making them feel welcome, part of the process, and equally valued.
What do you think, or when do you think that study participants believe their participation is finished? Phil, do you have any thoughts about that?
That's an interesting question. I was thinking about it before we started. I'm not sure that it always happens, but it should always happen, which is that anybody who's participated in a trial should be kept aware of developments within the trial, both during it and after it, especially in terms of people's sense of altruism. Often the motivation for participating in a trial is feeling that you're going to help other people, maybe who have your condition or your difficulty subsequently. So you've got a vested interest in knowing what happens next. So I think there's a moral responsibility on those running trials to keep those patients in the loop in terms of subsequent stages of development, whether a trial is successful in terms of its aims and objectives, whether new approaches are developed and implemented, you know, what the benefits to patients down the line might be. I think is a critical component of a trial from a patient perspective, and ought to be built into it. I mean, I'm sure we've all got experience of being token patients and being consulted, which is you're asked for your opinion, but you've got a sense that clinicians are going to do what they wanted to do in the beginning anyway. So I think if you want people to feel committed to the trial, they need to be committed to the whole of the trial, beginning, during, and after. And I think it would be helpful to keep them updated with newsletters, bulletins, or whatever as to what's happening, how many people have been recruited, what are the initial outcomes that have been discovered as you go through the trial, etc. It needs to be like a loop, a sort of responsive process.
Neca,
Can I jump in on that?
Oh, sure, please.
Okay. Yeah,
Yes.
I suppose I just want to say, like, I think patient engagement and patient involvement is often, I think, overcomplicated. And I think basically treat patients that you bring in as you would any other colleague. And I think it would be unlikely for people from the same organization to just work with people on a trial or a project and then not, you know, at the next, I don't know, quarterly meeting or whatever, give them an update. And I think patients should be treated the same way. And also in the UK, when I look through research applications for the Research Ethics Committee, there's a little box that says, are you going to inform participants of the outcomes of the trial? And they tick yes, and it just says the results will be posted on clinicaltrials.gov. And actually, I don't think that's good enough. And I think, because often they don't even get a thank you letter a lot of the time. And I think that, yeah, like Phil says, like you want to know, where, which conference is it going to be presented at, what the results are, what's happening next, what's going on with market access and stuff like that. I think you just want to be at least given the opportunity to know as much as possible if you want to.
I was going to ask Nneka, would you want to know what the next study might be in developing the study drug, even knowing that you might not be able to participate? Would you want to know what else is happening?
Definitely.
Would you want to know if it were approved by the competent authority?
Yeah, so I think a major part of the reason I took part in my trial is exactly what Phil was saying earlier, was to allow things to be better for those that are diagnosed after me, for them to have better access to treatment, better access to care and things like that. So being made aware of where the trials and the studies go later is huge. I think also the results of it, in the sense that, yes, this drug has been approved, or no, this drug hasn't been approved. However, here's what's happened in other countries. Here's, where we think we're going to go next in this country. It makes a really, really big difference. The communities that people who have disorders or diseases and profiles for are global. And so it may be a fact that I'm in a trial in the UK, but the drug that I'm on a trial for is available in the States. And somebody in my network group says to me, oh, I'm looking for a new medication, I'm looking for this kind of. If I'm not aware, they're probably not aware, and I'm actively part of this trial. So having that information out there and giving it to patients means it's going to make its way out there to patients who aren't necessarily on the trial but could still benefit, even if they're not in a country where I'm taking part in it.
All right, I'm going to move to the lightning round of asking you the question of 2 short answers, pick one. Okay. And then after that, I'll ask if there's anything more that you would like to add and share with people, and then we need to wrap up for today. So Thomas, if you could have a telehealth visit or a telephone visit, telehealth, telephone.
Health.
Telehealth. Phil, if you could have transportation coordinated for you or coordinate your own.
For you.
Would you like your ongoing communication, Nneka, to be email or mobile app?
Mobile app.
Thomas, wearable technologies that are doing the testing or having your testing done at the site?
Wearables.
Wearables.
Always going to say that.
You want to do that one too, Phil?
No.
An at-home nursing visit or an in-person site visit?
Me, an at-home visit, especially if I'm a poorly person.
Liverpool or Man City? Nneka?
Ooh.
Oh, as an Arsenal fan, I could not answer that question. I'm sorry.
Excellent. Thomas, Arsenal or Man City?
Man City. Man City.
Arsenal.
Man City all the way.
If it's good enough for the Gallaghers, it's good enough for me.
Phil, Arsenal or Liverpool?
I'm from Liverpool, so it's always going to be Liverpool.
There
You
you
should have asked me that question in the beginning.
I can't thank each of you enough for participating with us today. Are there any last thoughts that you would like to pass on to the clinical research teams? Thomas?
We've been talking about patient engagement and stuff for meaningfully probably 5 or 10 years now. I know it's kind of began way before that, but I suppose if anybody's watching this, I just hope that they have some really good leadership above them to facilitate the space to get things wrong. I think we do an awful lot of talking about patient engagement, and you're going to, you won't go far wrong if you just want to try and do something and just start learning rather than talking about it. If you think you've got a good idea of how to get things done, just give it a stab and see how it goes.
Phil, anything? Last words or thoughts?
I've got a few comments going back to the notion of panels, patient panels. I think there's a great strength in having the mix that we talked about. I've certainly got direct experience of a panel where having novice people in the panel helped the development of the trial, because they were able to ask what might be the stupid questions, like what's randomization? How does that work? And it's quite challenging for people in the trial to be able to explain it to somebody who's got no basis of knowledge of what randomization is about. That was just one example of how it was very powerful to have people in the room who didn't know the answers to such questions. So I think that is something that, you know, we've talked about that is a great strength. I've been thinking about trials, and I've been thinking about trials where there might be drug A and drug B, where people are randomized to one or the other. The outcome of the trial could be that drug A is actually the wonder drug. Drug B or the placebo obviously doesn't do the job. I've got a concern for the patients on the arm that gets the placebo or drug B. And I would have thought there's a moral and ethical responsibility for, if it's possible, and it may not be possible, but for the patients who didn't get the wonder drug to have access to it at the end of the trial. You know, in the UK, maybe the drugs are at no cost, but in the States, for example, yeah, that could be a real problem, that you've been part of a trial that proves that drug A is the way to go, but you can't access it having participated in that trial. That is something out it on the day, but communication, we've all said, is pretty vital if you want real and genuine patient participation in trials. That's a full-time job. Somebody in the trial team needs to have that as their full-time role. I mean, in the UK, we have research nurses who do support trials, but they don't just support one trial, they support lots of trials. They're really busy people. So the kind of between appointment communication with people may not actually take place just because of workload. I think you need to build in that role within your trial structure from the get-go, because it's critical from a patient point of view. And that doesn't need to be a technical or clinical person. That can be anybody who's able to get some good communication going with trial participants. But it's a job. It is a job, and it ought to be somebody's role to do that job, would be my suggestion.
Thank you so much, Phil. Nneka, can you close it out for us with your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing that is very important to me and I think is forgotten a lot of times, is yes, that those coordinating the trials are experts, but patients are experts in a different way. And it's really important to keep that in mind. These are people who have to live and do life with and work alongside these diagnoses and conditions. And so, yes, we're doing these trials to try and work out if we can find better medicines and things like that. But how does this affect them? What is actually going to be success for them compared to what is success for us? Even if the trial doesn't succeed, have we helped them? Have we kind of encouraged them to see that their condition, their treatment is being taken seriously, and they're being heard and they're being listened to? There are different types of expertise that we need to remember and take on board when we do patient panels or when we're beginning and studying trials.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time each of you have spent with me over the last couple of weeks, and hope we'll continue our conversation in the months ahead. Thank you again.